All right, so we are continuing on in Deuteronomy. Um, what a lovely book, must say. Uh, we we were talking this morning. Our first song this morning is "Greatest Commands," and you know it's hard to get into that when you've been like studying, getting prepared for class, and you're hearing about all of the death and things that go in Deuteronomy. It's just uh, other side of the dynamic. It's nice. So we are going to start with chapter 5 today. We're going to move through that one very quickly. As I've noted in the last two classes, the only two classes so far, we're a little bit behind where I think we need to be. We're going to move through chapter 5 very quickly today, simply because the majority of it covers the Ten Commandments. We've had multiple classes on those in previous Sunday mornings, just within the past handful of months. They were wonderful. Besides the fact that all of these are in Exodus 20, that's really kind of their main living spot. We're really just kind of in the recap mode here. So we are going to jump right in. I'm going to start checking off my boxes for those that are following along with my electronic support up here on the stand. So, little side note, chapter 5 starts into what is kind of thought of, don't know if it's true or not, kind of thought of the second speech by Moses. So generally there's thought that the first 4 chapters were delivered together as one package. And maybe he took a break to eat or drink something. I don't know. Came back. There's kind of this second speech, and this one's a long one that covers the majority of Deuteronomy, if I'm not mistaken, because I haven't refreshed my memory to that far ahead yet. So all the things we've talked about so far, he took a breath, and now we're going to talk some more again. But we're going to continue with this, again, very long, drawn-out concept of telling you things you've already been told so that you get it. And even within just these couple of chapters we might look at today, you're going to hear a lot of the same things over and over and over, and a lot of reminders of what you've already been told or what they have already been told. We'll just stick ourselves in their shoes or their sandals or their knots as we listen to that. So the start of the second speech, again, that doesn't really have to mean a whole lot other than there's kind of a distinction, a little bit of a break, and that we're going back and capturing some other things now. So he's going to go back, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments. So we're kind of jumping back in the historical timeline again, as our blurry lines are doing throughout this whole book. So 10 Commandments, Exodus 20 is where you'll really want to go to dig into those, or go back and replay the Sunday morning class recordings from a handful of months ago that Jen led us through, where we really dug into the meat and flesh of those. So that's good. So again, we're doing some historical things this morning. So this is kind of, again, reinforcing to the Israelite nation that they need to remember those things. They need to learn from them, and they need to make sure they're still following all of those laws and decrees that he gave before. He's reinforcing now and then peppering a few more here or there in between. So lots of movement going on. So recap 10 Commandments. Don't have any other gods before me. Check it off. Don't have any images, as it says here, or idols to be worshipped, right? And so again, remember from last week, we talked about God making sure they remembered, you don't have anything to create an idol after. I've never given you any form to fashion an idol after. You've only seen me as fire or as cloud or a voice. So how in the world could you come up with an idol that has some physical shape or definition to it when I haven't given you that? So it kind of follows here in the Ten Commandments. He says, don't have any images or idols to worship. He's already kind of reminded us it's really hard for us to even do that because he hasn't given us anything to fashion it after. So when you stop and think about that one, that kind of makes a little bit of sense. How would we do that when we don't know what God looks like other than flame, cloud, or voice? So it really, I mean, sitting here now, looking back, it should be pretty easy to go, yeah, we don't need to make an idol because we're going to carve something, we're going to melt something. What does that really mean? So that's kind of good. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. And do not covet what your neighbor has. Now, granted, those are a little bit of very succinct summary of them. They're not the typical that you'd find attached to a building somewhere, maybe, or things you may have hanging on your wall. These are just general concepts. Just again, the reminder, hey, I told you these things, they're really important. So, people up to this point have seen God's glory and his majesty through all of the things he's done. And they've heard his voice from the fire at this point. He talks about leading them as fire or as cloud. When they've heard him, it's generally been associated with the fire. So the cloud exists. He didn't really do much talking with the cloud. He did the talking with the fire. Again, some of those things that could make you scratch your head a little bit. And, what might we be thinking about that? I won't dig into that one for you because that's probably a very personal thing. We could each come up with something that makes us feel a certain way about being spoken to through fire instead of cloud or a rock or whatever else it is, the wind blowing. So what's important next, though, is that, again, still recapping, the Israelite people believed, and probably rightfully so, that they would die if they heard the Lord speak any longer, because people just didn't hear God speak to them out loud in a voice. Maybe they hear it in their heads, as we probably most often time might consider that we do today. There's usually not a voice we hear in our ears with our human hearing that says that's God's voice talking to me right now. Now, maybe we do. There are certain situations that might be very well be an appropriate thing to consider when we think about God working through people. These folks, I don't think were in that mindset. There's a pillar of fire and it's speaking to me. That's God. So the folks are a little scared. Hey, God's talked to us enough. He's told us some pretty high, powerful stuff here. We don't really feel comfortable being talked to anymore. So Moses, you go do all that for us. You seem to have the buffer. So they're, again, recapping a little history, but they're making sure that they still want to hear God, but they're a little scared about it. So Moses has kind of been the go-between, and he will continue to do so, certainly by their choosing, if that's how it goes. So chapter 5, we're going to jump all the way down to verse 27 now. Again, I've recapped a whole bunch of things kind of in summary mode because it was restated from Exodus. Verse 27, toward the end of that verse and following, the people say, we will listen and obey, which is pretty important because he's just got done talking so much and reminding so much about how that's what they better do. So they say, you got it, thumbs up. We're going to do it. We're going to listen to you and we will obey you. And the word in the Bible is God was pleased with this response. Now, whether they knew that at the time or not, I don't know. It doesn't say it exactly like that in the translations we have. Somehow I kind of figured they would have understood that was a good thing and God was accepting of their declaration that we will listen and obey. So then they returned to their tents. Moses was told to stay and receive the commands that we just covered, the 10 Commandments, and the decrees and the laws, and to teach them to follow in the land that they will soon possess. Okay, so again, he's recapping for us. They have some communication with God, and they say, okay, that's enough. Moses is the guy. We're going to sleep. See you later. Moses does his thing. And when God's talking to Moses, he reminds him to make sure they're taught that they're to do what is commanded. Listen and obey like they just committed to. And he goes a little further and says, don't turn to the right or the left. I could just talk about last week and paths and all that, stay on the path. That works until there's a fork in the path and you got to make a decision. So don't turn right or left. Don't get off the path. Stay on the path. But when you have a choice, you got to make a choice. But you still need to be on a path. I won't dwell on the path too much. The path in the past. So it closes out chapter 5 with walk in obedience so you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the promised land. Live long and prosper, a little Star Trek-y there. for our trekkers. That's good. The other thing is I'll kind of point out, I haven't referred to this a lot, certainly not today yet. From the first week, we talked about how this all seems to be a balance. He gives us things to do. Here's the good things if we do it. This continues to build that balance. Walk so that you can live long and prosper. Trying to separate those out a little bit. To be able to remain in the promised land. So it's another one of those, I'm telling you these things, they're good, do this, you get to do that. The things that aren't said there are, if you don't do these things, then you won't get to do that. So it's presented in a positive light. So that's nice and refreshing. We appreciate that. But we do need to be mindful that even though it's presented positively, we have to make sure we're balancing. Do good, get good. Do bad. It's going to be some hard days. Okay. So that's kind of chapter 5 in a nutshell. We burned through that in about 7 minutes. That's great. We're not caught up yet, but that's okay. So we're going to move into chapter 6 now. The little heading at the beginning of chapter 6 in my electronic version of the Bible said, love the Lord your God. Okay, so maybe we're setting a tone here. This again is not really written in there. It's what someone's kind of priming us to be ready to hear. So I just did that because it probably fits. So he tells the Israelite nation, you will enjoy long life, increase greatly, just as he promised. So that's what he's getting ready to tell us. Your things are going to be good. You've just said, we'll listen and obey. He's reminded you that's really great. Things will be, you'll live long and prosper and get to stay in the promised land. Those are good things. Here we go. First part of this next chapter, he's reiterating that again. Must be an important concept. We hear it over and over, probably important. I found this one interesting in verse 4. The version, the NIV I was reading, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But there's there's a few alternates of how that might be written. One of them that I tended to like a bit was the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Saying the same things, stated a different way, but gives us a very direct connection. Because Lord, our God, okay, he's ours. Here's the Lord. He's one. He's it. Whereas the alternate, the Lord is our God, a little more possessive. It's very specific, possessive. He's ours. He is the Lord alone. He's it. He is the one, but there are no others. I thought that was maybe a nice way to see that and say that. And we're told to love him with all our heart, our soul, and our strength. And again, I'm saying our. At the time, that's it's being spoken to the Israelite nation. Most of us are not Israelites, but that's okay. This all still applies to us. We're learning and applying it to ourselves as well. So love him with all your heart, soul, and strength. We hear that from time to time, and that's certainly a good thing to hear. In verse 7, he then reminds the people again, you are to teach the commandments. Teach them to and impress them on your children. We can assume then that's on your children and on their children and on their children's children. And the idea here is you will continue learning. Again, this is really kind of recapping what we've already been told, what they've already been told several times. You will learn by repetition. And the only way these folks really have to learn is to hear it and hear it and hear it. They're not picking up a multi-volume set of books and reading through all this. It's being told to them most likely very verbally. So it's very important to not forget these things. And again, as we talked about previous weeks, this isn't a one-time. Do it and you're done. Check the box. Go on to the next task that you prefer to do. This is a lifelong requirement. There's learning, there's understanding, there's passing it on. So that maybe the folks don't cycle back into a problem area like they have in the past. He goes a little further. Talk about them constantly. So maybe not just Sunday morning Bible class or maybe Saturdays at that point. Maybe that's not it. Talk about them constantly. That's an important factor. verses 8 and 9, we're going to get into a little dialogue here. This is interesting stuff that I was digging through. Verses 8 and 9 talk about tying the law's decrees, tying them as symbols on your hands, bind them to your foreheads, and write them on door frames and gates. So again, I'm scratching my head a little bit. Okay, there's some interesting things going on here. How do you tie a law or decree as a symbol? How would they have done that? What does it really mean? So jumping into a different translation, the ESV and several others prescribe the word frontlets. So I saw the word frontlets. That's a new one for me. I've heard other things that end in lets, but not frontlets. I haven't heard of that one. So did a little digging, a little searching. That doesn't mean it's all 100% accurate. So pardon me if I've got any of this wrong. But a frontlet, theoretically, what I'm led to believe, a frontlet in those times was just simply a piece of cloth or a headband. Okay, they also, at some times and in some areas, would call that a phylactery. If you're liking long college kind of sounding words, phylactery. That one, best I can tell, is just a small leather box that contains a portion of the Mosaic Law. So that's a little bit more from the, researching more the Jewish traditions. A phylactery is a small leather box that contains a portion of the Mosaic Law, and it's strapped to their wrist or on a headband. I haven't seen a lot of folks walk around like that with them, but I'm not necessarily in areas where they might still be practicing this, and I'm certain they're out there, not a problem. Okay, Orthodox Jews was a comment from Michelle. They do still do that. Seems like I may have seen sometime, but I was probably curious at the moment, but didn't strike me as something that should shake my piece of earth. So what's interesting to me now is I'm thinking, okay, you're wearing a headband. Well, is there some significance to that? So the forehead or the brow is apparently generally known as important for expressing your basic emotions. So think about talking to somebody with their hand over their forehead and you can't tell if they're raising their eyebrows or they're wrinkling or there's a lot of description, communication that happens in your forehead area. I hadn't really ever thought about it, but I think about it now, it makes some sense. So here's my little jump. I came up with this one, again, maybe totally off target. But it seems to me that if you have something covering your forehead that's a biblical religious item or reason it's there, is that symbolic of saying my emotions don't matter. My emotions are what I'm carrying there instead. So that when you see me or you're talking to me or whoever, you're seeing the Lord, not the rest of this person's face and telling you what they think or feel. I'm wondering, is there a connection there? Is that why they're to have it close by? And now if you put it across your forehead, is that another way to message that I am the Lord's and my goal is to represent him? Less of me, more of him. I don't know. I could be wrong. It was the way that I thought about it, that I thought that seems plausible as maybe some of the reason why you might do that. At least it sounds good today. So now doors and gates, because that was another piece of it. So we go from hands, foreheads, and then we talk about door frames and gates. So since that does still happen today as well, I'm pretty certain of that one too. The ones that were hung on doors and gates were typically written on parchment, just like the little ones that might hang on your body somewhere. So again, think frontlet or phylactery mode. Just some kind of little inscription that you've got in a small case. And at the home, it's hung at shoulder height to the right side of the doorway to the home. At least from what I was researching, that seems to be, that's how it's done. Now, that's not listed here in Deuteronomy. So It's not that exact to say on your home, it'll be shoulder height and to the right. So I don't know where that part came from. There's likely something there. I don't know that we got enough time for digging in and trying to figure out who might have the right opinion on that one. But in addition to doing it just that way, it's typically done within 30 days of moving into a new home. So you get a 30-day pass to get everything squared away and make sure you're not going to remodel real quick, I guess, or repaint. So within 30 days, that's expected to be there. Most likely, we could talk to some folks that are practicing that today and probably get a lot more detail on that. So that may be an assignment for somebody sitting up here in the front row giving me hassle. So if we get more information on that, we'll let you know. Suffice it to say, there's some very specific requirements that at this point would appear people have put on. I don't see that in Deuteronomy saying, do it exactly this way at 1.5 cubit tie. That is curious, but it's also not uncommon. There's a lot of things we add to, I think, that put a lot of rules and restrictions on things we do or don't do that maybe aren't quite so clear here for us. And maybe that's also easily just lost in translation as well. Okay. So jump down to verse 10. Again, we're still in chapter 6, verse 10. We get given a little glimpse again of what the promised land will be like. And the nation is told, you will have flourishing cities, houses filled with things you didn't provide, wells you didn't dig, vineyards and olive groves you didn't plant. So again, remember, these folks have been in a desert for a while. Their ancestors have been in the desert for even longer. So they're hearing about these, oh, this is great, this is nice. The message here was, remember all that stuff that I'm telling you you're about to get? You didn't have to work for that. You didn't make that. You didn't create it. You didn't make it happen. I'm God and I'm giving it to you. You're just going to walk in and here it is. You didn't cause that. The Lord did. He provided all of that. And if that wasn't enough, and remember, hey, he brought you out of slavery from Egypt. So not just you're in the desert, now you're going to be in land of plenty. You were almost worse than desert. You were slaves. Maybe not in the desert, but it probably didn't feel much better. Probably wasn't better than wandering around in the desert because you were taken care of there too. We'll get to that later. So it's a nice restatement, a little recap. Hey, this is going to be good and great. But just remember, you didn't cause that. You didn't do that. God provided that for you. Don't forget. So now we get into another fun one with a little dialogue. Verse 13. Sometimes I struggle with this one even before I was trying to research Deuteronomy. Verse 13, in essence, says, fear the Lord. And oftentimes we're going to apply our human concept of fear to that statement. Fear the Lord, be scared of the Lord, do or else. But does that sound like the God we know, or the God we think we know, or the God that's probably talking to these people to encourage them and give them? Probably not. So here's some things to consider about fear. So here's a hint, spoiler alert, it's a positive thing. We go with fear is bad. Here the message is fear is not bad. Fear means really something different. God is loving and just. We're told that over and over. He's just spent books and books worth of talking and writing to tell us God is loving and just. So how does that equate to what we think of as fear? So fear can produce awe. So maybe there's a fear component, but what it gets us to is really the intended message. Maybe not be scared of the Lord. Maybe fear the Lord so that this comes from that being in awe, be reverent of his holiness, be in awe of that. Fear can also produce faith. We know that God is angry about sin, but he saves us from that. And he saves us from caving into our own sinful nature. I got that from a couple of different websites and blogs, et cetera, of people kind of entering through this journey of what does it mean to fear the Lord when we don't try to make it negative, that we're scared of him. We should be scared of. And certainly we've had many, many lessons that tell us about how we might fear our parent or parents. It's not a bad fear that we're always in fear of our life, which might even be more applicable in the Bible times. Because he kind of said that, do this or else. But this is a reverent fear that you're paying due respect. You're giving them absolute attention and your commitment to obeying what it is they've set out before you. There's my thought on verse 13. So we are to, I believe this is in there because I didn't put asterisks, which means it's just my silly thinking. We're to serve only him. We are to take oaths in his name, which means you probably better be very certain you intend to follow through with it, because you're tying God into whatever it is you say you're willing to do and accept and commit to. Obviously not something to be taken lightly. We are to not follow other gods, specifically of the other people around you. So again, rewind, historical timeline mesh. They're about to go into the promised land, or what will become the promised land. They have to fight and conquer and take these lands over, but God will deliver it to them. He will provide it. But they do have to do a little bit of the work. They just already are supposed to know that they're going to succeed. It will be good. So they're going to be around all these other people that are not following God and God alone. So he's reminding them, don't follow those other gods, especially those other people that are around you, the people you're going to go overtake. And he reminds them that God is among you, and he will destroy you in his jealousy. Time for a little more dialogue. And we talked about fear, but now we're talking about God being jealous. And this is one I've struggled with a lot because, if you've been in a relationship, jealousy is usually a bad thing when that one comes up. For whatever reason and for whatever situation, we're not talking about that today. But jealousy is typically, for me, has a very negative connotation. Jealousy is not good. It means you're not trusting. It means you're not something. But here it's talking about God's jealousy. Well, another head scratcher. God's not going to have anything negative about it. That's just not even on the table. So the jealousy can't be bad like we think it's bad. It can't be a negative. There's got to be something that's positive and good from it. So my good old friends at Christianity.com, since I want to try to plug my source every once in a while, sources, they indicated that jealousy is only presented in the idolatry context, which is where we are, by God himself. Nobody else in the Bible presents anything about being jealous in the idolatry context. Just him. Probably because nobody should be idolizing any other person, although we probably do that quite a bit. So this one is, the jealousy here is about idolatry. He's just said, don't look at the other idols that all these other gods, that these other people that you're going to go conquer. Don't be enamored with that. I'm going to be jealous of that. This is the only time. It's not the only time. The idolatry context is only addressed in the Bible by God himself. Nobody else talks about this. And the point here is that he needs you to honor the covenant and the bond and the treaty that he's been describing and setting up this whole time. There's a reason he's given it to us. And he's painting the picture of why you need to be listening to this. He is among us. So, again, digging a little deeper, because that sounds fine, but how do I apply that? What is it? Where's the meat that I can somehow rationalize in my limited human mindset? So the Hebrew word for Danny, is he still in the room? Okay, but I can say this wrong and it'll be okay. The Hebrew word for jealous in this particular passage is kana. Qanna. And I had to look up how to pronounce it. Thankfully, somebody had researched that, and it's kana. I don't know which one's emphasized, so take your pick. It means jealous. So that's pretty simple. It means jealous. Okay. That's handy. The translation means what it's supposed to mean. It means jealous. But it also means zealous. One letter different makes a big deal. So zealous, to remind ourselves, since I looked it up too, because if I'm going to stand up here and say the word, I probably ought to know what it actually means, not just what I think it means. It gives the message of caring passionately. So jealous, zealous, caring passionately. That one magically fits a whole lot better into what we believe God's telling us about. I'm going to be jealous. No, not the negative piece. I'm going to be jealous, zealous. I'm going to be caring passionately about you. That fits. How does it not fit? Even in the context of presenting laws and idolatry, this context now gets us, he cares passionately. Where else could we go? Okay, there's my aside for that portion of the warning. Verse 16, he reminds the people again, don't repeat what you did at Massa. So if you don't remember what that is, because I didn't either, that's where the people doubted. And Moses went a little further than that, than doubting. That's the story of him bringing water from the rock with his staff, which is not what God told him to do. This being the one thing that we're told, although there may have been others, the one thing we're specifically told is, and here's why you're not going to the promised land, partner. I told you to do it this way. You went and did something different. You still accomplished the objective. The end result was water came from the rock, just like I needed, but you didn't do it the way I said. So he's reminding the whole nation, don't make the mistake you made at that point in time in that situation. The message there being, he wanted their trust without having to have some physical act of human intervention. Speaking to the rock was enough. And Moses said, I got to hit this thing because that's what it did last time. He wasn't paying attention to the requirement, the directive. Did water still come from the rock? Yes. God made the water come from the rock just the same. But it didn't accomplish the objective we believe he would have intended. Or he would have said, hey, okay, I didn't want you to hit it with the staff, but you did, so no big deal. They got their water. Message received. That's not what happened. This causes Moses this cost him a lot. No promised land for him. After all of the years and years and years of work that he's done, being the go-between and being the de facto human peace leader, he now doesn't get to see promised land. For seemingly this one little oops. So our message here is to do right and good in the Lord's sight. He gives instruction, follow it. Don't turn left, don't turn right. All of these things are just blending together, which, much like how my teaching style of saying the same thing over and over again, sometimes with a couple of different words and sometimes not. This feels very much the same. So do what's right. That gets you down the right path where you need to be. In verse 20, he even tells them what's going to happen in the future, which is probably already happening then. Verse 20 is the children will ask, what is the meaning of the decrees and laws and all these stipulations, all this? What's the meaning of all this? Because they didn't experience what led up to it. Another reiteration, tell them, tell them, tell them, tell them. And when they forget, tell them again. And even when they don't forget, tell them again. They've got to have this so deeply ingrained that there's just never a doubt. The laws and decrees, stipulations, commandments, all of that is packaged together so that you know that your relationship with your God, what he gives, what he expects, therefore what you get. So he reminds them, you were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. Reminds them again, I should probably say. But you've been brought out by God's mighty hand. You've seen great and terrible signs and wonders on Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. That's an easy sentence to stand here and read. When you've lived a portion of it, or your maybe closer ancestors have lived it or died it, probably means a little bit more than, again, somebody here in 2022 standing here and reading it or writing it or thinking it. It probably doesn't really kind of carry the same real deep message, knowing that just 2 generations before, somebody was in that situation, your family. Whereas maybe 2 generations ahead of you right now, you might still be able to go see or talk to on the phone, or take a picture of and take them to school. Probably has a lot more deeper meaning to those folks at that time than it would be to us trying to just read it. But just consider, they were slaves. They weren't just poof overnight and then they weren't. There was a transition, and God did that. It's not easy to just, I'm done being a slave, see you later. You don't get to make that choice. You don't get to just walk out of it the next day and put it behind you. There's a transition, and you can't do that yourself. Thus the definition of slavery. It's not your choice. So when God leads you through that and becomes your path to freedom in him, through him, which we talk about freedom in Christ a lot. It's a good thing. Those all go together. So again, it's presenting a very clear picture. I've given you all of this. Give. I need you to do. I need you to be. Those are, for us, intentional words. It's action. And that ties up here in verse 24. Obey all this law before God as he commanded. It's kept alive and will always prosper. And that will be your righteousness. That's your connection to God. Your keeping of his commandments and his laws, just like he said. That's what keeps you alive. That's what makes you prosper. That's what turns into his righteousness. So you see a little bit of a shift there. When we talk about things we do and what we get for it, what we earn from it, because we made it happen. And here he's reminding them again, I've done all of this for you. I've given this to you. This is not of your doing. This is not your work that's caused this. This is God's. And maybe that's still actioned through Moses. Okay, we can understand that. Moses was the go-between. And the people over and over continued to want it that way. And God's okay with that. It's working for most of the time. So, we're out of time. I certainly can't start chapter 7, but that's okay. We made it through 2. That's been our record so far. 2 chapters a day. So that's where I'll leave it with you, is again, just keep that in your mind of how he's done all of these things, and that big balance, the invisible balance that we can't see, but we better know. He gives, he expects. We do, we get. We don't do, we don't get. He's building this, again, treaty style. I'll give you these things if you do these things, and if you do these things, you get these great things. And when you don't do them, well, there's some bad stuff. We try to don't talk about those too much. Certainly not in our time frame. We don't like the negativity. Deuteronomy can get negative real easy. But surely that's intentional. It certainly carries an important message for us to help drive it home. So that's what I have for you this morning. Thank you, my friendly Zoomers. The faces, they're so lovely. And those of you here that are close enough to spit on me here in a second, that's just great too. Yes, the faces here are lovely too. I'll be polite. Yes. Okay, so we'll see you next week. Thank you.